What would it take to shatter a belief that has held firm for generations? Not through argument, not through doubt, not through the slow erosion of time, but in a single night, in a single moment, in a silence so complete it became its own kind of answer. There are traditions in this world that don't ask to be understood. They ask only to be followed, passed down through bloodlines and seasons and the careful, unspoken authority of those who came before. They carry a weight that has nothing to do with logic and everything to do with something older. A relationship between human beings and the world they inhabit that predates every system we've ever built to explain it. These are the rituals that persist, not because anyone proved they work, but because, generation after generation, nothing ever suggested they didn't. The forest received what was brought to it. The balance held. The community endured. And so the tradition continued, as traditions do. Not questioned, not examined. Simply carried forward on the shoulders of those who understood that some agreements are not made in words. For as long as anyone in that community could remember, the ritual had never failed. Not once. Not in drought years or flood years. Not in times of illness or conflict. Not in any of the seasons that tested the endurance of the people who lived by its terms. Whatever the forest was owed, it was given. And whatever the forest gave in return, the stability, the abundance, the sense of something ancient watching over the edge of the known world, it had always been enough. The elders who held the memory of it spoke of it not with the enthusiasm of believers trying to convince anyone, but with the quiet certainty of people who have simply never had reason to doubt. It had always worked. It would always work. That was not a hope. It was a fact, as settled as the ground beneath their feet. Until the night, it wasn't. What you're about to discover might genuinely unsettle something in you, not because it's frightening in the way that horror is frightening, but because it touches something that sits much closer to the center of how we understand the world. The idea that an ancient agreement can be broken, that something which has always received can suddenly, without warning and without explanation, refuse. That the forest, or whatever lives at the edge of the forest, in the space where human certainty ends and something else begins, can look at what is offered and turn away from it. The elders had no record of this. In all the accumulated memory of everyone who had ever participated in this ritual, in all the stories passed down through all the generations that had honored this particular agreement with the dark between the trees, there was not a single account of the offering being rejected. Accepted in silence, yes. Received without visible response, often. But refused, actively, unmistakably, in a way that left every witness shaken. Never. Not once in living memory. Not once in the memory beyond living memory. Never. Stay with me, because the details of what happened that night go deeper than the surface of the story suggests. There is something woven into this account that speaks to questions most of us carry without knowing how to ask them. Questions about what we owe the world, about what the world owes us, about the agreements we make in silence with forces we cannot name. And the answer that emerged from that forest, on that particular night, was one that no one present had been prepared to receive. Before we go any further into what actually unfolded that night, and I promise you, the details are unlike anything the tradition had ever produced before, I want to step outside the story for just a moment and speak to you directly. If something in that introduction already stirred something in you, if the idea of an ancient agreement being broken, of something refusing what it had always accepted, landed somewhere deeper than just curiosity, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment right now and tell me. Have you ever experienced a moment where something that had always worked simply stopped? Where a pattern you trusted completely revealed itself to have limits you never knew existed? It doesn't have to be mystical. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It could be something quiet and personal, a relationship, a belief, a certainty you carried for years that one day, without warning, handed itself back to you. If you have a story like that, share it below. Because the conversation that happens in the comments section of a video like this one is genuinely part of what makes it worth making. There is something particular about the people who are drawn to stories like this. Stories that don't fit neatly into any category, that refuse to be fully explained, that ask more questions than they answer. They tend to be people who are not satisfied with the surface of things, people who feel the weight of what isn't said as much as what is. People who understand, somewhere in their bones, that the most important truths rarely arrive in straightforward packages. If that describes you, and I suspect it does, given that you're still here, then this channel was built with you in mind. So if this video is resonating, please hit the like button. Not as a formality, but because it genuinely matters. Every like is a signal that this kind of storytelling deserves to reach further, to find the other people out there who are looking for exactly this without knowing where to look. You pressing that button is how they find it. It's a small action with a reach that extends far beyond what it looks like. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love for you to consider it. Not because of numbers, but because there are more stories like this one waiting. Stories that sit at the edge of what we can explain, that ask us to hold complexity and uncertainty without rushing to resolve them. Stories that stay with you. When you subscribe, you're not just adding yourself to a list, you're becoming part of a community of people who believe that the most interesting territory is the kind that doesn't come with a map. Your presence here, your comment, your like, your decision to stay, is what keeps this space alive and growing. It's what allows stories like this one to travel to the person who needs them most. And there is always someone out there who needs exactly this, at exactly this moment. Your participation is part of how they get there. So thank you, genuinely, and without any script behind it. Now, back to the forest. Because what happened after the offering was made is the part that broke something open in everyone who witnessed it. The ritual had proceeded exactly as it always had, every detail observed, every tradition honored. The child was brought to the edge of the trees in the old way, at the appointed hour, under the same sky that had witnessed every previous offering. And then the forest did something that none of the elders, with all their accumulated knowledge, all their years of tending this agreement, had any framework to receive. Something moved between the trees, something approached, and then, at the moment of arrival, it simply turned away. And the silence that followed was not the silence of acceptance. It was something else entirely, something that felt, to every person present, like the beginning of a question no one knew how to ask. The ritual did not begin with a name. It began, as most ancient things do, with a need. Somewhere in the deep history of the community that practiced it, before the written records, before the oral tradition had been formalized into the precise sequence of words and actions that later generations would inherit, there was a moment when human beings standing at the edge of a particular forest made a decision. Not a decision that was recorded in any document, not one that was announced or deliberated or voted upon. A decision of the kind that gets made in the dark, in desperation, when every other option has been exhausted, and the only thing left is the oldest, most instinctive human move available, the offer. The outstretched hand, the thing placed at the threshold and left there, with no guarantee of what comes next, but with the hope, the profound, unargued, bone-deep hope, that whatever lives on the other side of that threshold will receive it. The forest received it. And from that first receiving, everything else followed. The tradition built itself around the response, not immediately, not in any single generation, but slowly, across the kind of time that changes landscapes and languages and the faces of mountains, the kind of time that turns a single event into a pattern, and a pattern into a law, and a law into the deepest kind of truth, the kind that no one questions because it has been confirmed so many times by so many people over so many seasons, that questioning it would feel not like intellectual courage, but like madness. The specific origins of the community are less important than the nature of what they built in that forest shadow. They were people who lived close to the land in the way that people who depend on it for survival always do, with an intimacy that modern life has mostly erased, an attention to the rhythms of the natural world that borders at times on what we would call spiritual and what they would have simply called necessary. They knew the forest the way you know a neighbor who has been beside you your whole life. Not completely, not without mystery, but with a familiarity that includes the mystery rather than pretending it doesn't exist. They knew which parts of it were safe and which were not. They knew the sounds it made in different seasons, in different weathers, under different pressures. They knew the silence it kept, and they had learned over generations to read the difference between silences. The silence of the forest at rest, the silence of the forest watching, the silence of the forest receiving. That last silence was the one the ritual was designed to produce, and for as long as anyone could remember, it had produced it. The structure of the ritual itself was precise in its simplicity. There was an appointed time, always at the edge of night, when the last light had not quite left the sky, and the first dark had not quite arrived, in that threshold moment when the world sits between its two faces. There was an appointed place, a specific point at the forest's edge that had been identified, through means no one living could explain, as the correct location. The exact spot had markers, a particular configuration of roots, a stone whose shape had become familiar through centuries of use, a gap between two trees that framed a specific depth of shadow. Anyone who had been part of the tradition long enough could find it without being told where to look. The body simply knew. There was a child, always a child, young enough to be considered uncorrupted by the compromises and complexities of adult life, old enough to walk the distance unaided. The child was prepared in specific ways that differed slightly across different eras of the tradition, but always preserved the same essential quality, a kind of deliberate simplicity, no adornment that didn't belong to the ritual, no sound made unnecessarily, no resistance. The preparation was not about making the child frightened. In fact, the elders who guided this process were always careful to produce the opposite effect. They spoke of it as a gift, an honor, a moment of contact with something that the rest of the community could only approach from a distance. The child, in this framing, was not a sacrifice in any violent sense. The child was a messenger, a bridge, a point of connection between the human world and whatever intelligence the forest contained. Whether the children believed this framing, whether it was sufficient to prevent fear, is a detail that the tradition never formally recorded. What it recorded was the outcome. The offering was made, the forest responded in its particular silence of receiving, and the community was assured of another cycle of protection and abundance. Season after season, generation after generation, the formula held. Now I want to go deeper into what the forest's response actually looked and felt like, because this is where the tradition becomes genuinely remarkable, and where understanding it requires setting aside the frameworks that modern life has given us for evaluating this kind of claim. Because the response was not invisible. It was not something that had to be taken on faith, reported by one person and accepted by everyone else. It was something that multiple witnesses, in every recorded performance of the ritual, experienced directly. Something that was, within the community's shared framework of understanding, unmistakably real. The sounds would change. This was the first and most consistent element across every account that the tradition preserved. In the moments following the child's arrival at the threshold, following the specific words or gestures or silences that completed the formal offering, the acoustic texture of the forest would shift in a way that experienced witnesses described as unmistakable. Not sudden, not dramatic, gradual. The way the quality of light changes when a cloud moves across the sun. Nothing turns off. Nothing turns on, but the character of what you're perceiving transforms in a way that the body registers before the mind has finished processing it. The birds would change their pattern first, not go silent. The tradition's accounts are specific on this point, and it matters, but shift register. The alarm calls would stop, the territorial songs would stop. What remained was something lower, more continuous, more ambient, a kind of sound that witnesses consistently described as the forest, settling, as if something that had been held at a certain tension released it, as if a room full of people who had been waiting for news received it, and the particular quality of the waiting dissolved. Then the wind, or the absence of it. Accounts vary here in their specifics, but converge on their essence. Something in the movement of air in and around the forest's edge would change in a way that felt deliberate, felt directed. Not the random unpredictability of weather, but something with a quality of intention, a movement toward the threshold, toward the offering that the most poetic witnesses described as breath. The forest breathing in what it had been given, taking it, accepting it. And then occasionally, not always, not in every performance, but often enough to be part of the tradition's memory, something would be seen. Not clearly, not in any form that could be pinned down and described with confidence. A shape in the deep shadow between the trees, at the edge of what the eye could reach. A density of dark that was different from the surrounding dark, that had a quality of presence, of attention, that the surrounding dark did not have. Something that was there and then wasn't, or that might never have been there in any form that a sober analysis would confirm, but that left in the people who perceived it a feeling that persisted long after the night was over. The feeling of having been seen, assessed, and accepted. This is the experience that the tradition was built around. Not a metaphor, not a collective delusion, but a shared phenomenological reality. Something that happened, consistently and repeatedly, to real people in a specific place over a very long period of time, and that produced the consistent outcome of a community that felt itself to be in right relationship with the world it inhabited. Whether you explain this through the lens of psychology, through the lens of ecology, through the lens of something that sits outside both of those categories, the functional reality of it is the same. The ritual produced an experience. The experience produced a sense of connection and security. The connection and security allowed the community to function, to cohere, to endure. And so, the ritual was preserved and repeated and passed down with the seriousness that anything receives when it has been proven over and over to work. The promise at the center of it, the thing the ritual was supposed to guarantee, was not simple. It was not a transaction in the modern sense, not a service agreement with clear deliverables. It was something more like a covenant, a mutual recognition. The community acknowledged the forest as a presence with its own reality, its own authority, its own needs. The forest acknowledged the community as a legitimate part of the world it governed, and in that mutual acknowledgement, both parties agreed to a kind of peace, an agreement not to treat each other as purely instrumental, not to take without giving, not to disrupt the balance that made both possible. Protection was part of it. The community believed that as long as the agreement held, the forest would not turn against them, that the dangers it contained would remain at a respectful distance, that the edge between the human world and the wild world would stay legible, that the thing or things that moved in the deep dark of those trees would not come across the threshold uninvited. Prosperity was part of it. The harvests, the hunts, the quality of the seasons, all were understood as expressions of the forest's disposition toward the community, and the ritual was the mechanism by which that disposition was maintained in the favorable range. And something harder to name was also part of it, something that has no clean modern equivalent, but that every ancient tradition that has ever existed in relationship with a particular piece of land seems to carry in some form. A sense of belonging, of being known by the place you live in, of not being merely a resident of a geography, but a participant in a relationship that the geography actively reciprocates. This is the thing that is hardest to translate across the gap between the world that ritual made possible and the world most of us inhabit now. We have largely lost the felt experience of being in a place that knows us, of living in a landscape that has a relationship with us, not as metaphor, not as poetic imagination, but as functional, experienced reality. The closest, Most modern people get to it is the feeling of returning to a childhood home or to a natural place that has been important across many years of a life, and finding that it receives them with a quality of recognition that is not entirely explicable by neurological processes of memory and association. There is something in those moments that gestures toward what the tradition was describing, something that makes the tradition feel less foreign than it might initially seem. The people who were preparing for the ritual on the night in question had been part of this tradition for their entire lives. They were not outsiders attempting to perform something unfamiliar. They were not recent converts testing a practice they had only recently adopted. They were people for whom this ritual was as integrated into the texture of their reality as any other foundational element of their world, as familiar as the seasons, as unquestioned as gravity. They had witnessed it performed by their elders. They had watched the forest respond. They had felt the shift in the air, heard the change in the birds, perceived some of them, that quality of presence at the threshold. They believed in it not abstractly, but in the way you believe in things that have been confirmed again and again by your own direct experience. And they needed it to work. That is the part of this that matters more than it might initially seem, and it is worth sitting with rather than moving past quickly. Because the desperation with which a ritual is performed has historically been considered by the traditions that use rituals to be a relevant variable, not in the sense that more desperate equals more effective, but in the sense that the quality of attention, of intention, of presence that a person brings to a sacred act is not irrelevant to its outcome. The tradition was not something you could perform mechanically with your mind elsewhere and expect the same result as a performance infused with full, genuine engagement. The forest, according to the tradition's own understanding of itself, received not just the physical form of the offering, but the spirit in which it was given. This particular group had gathered in the condition of people who have nothing left to fall back on. Something had gone wrong in the preceding season. The specific nature of the difficulty is less important than the emotional reality of it, which was the reality of a community that had reached the end of what its own efforts could address and had arrived at the ritual as a last resort rather than a routine observance. This was not the first time in the tradition's history that this had happened. The records contained accounts of other desperate performances, other offerings made in extremis, and in those accounts, the forest had always responded with what seemed to be a particular intensity, as if difficulty met with genuine surrender produced a quality of contact that ordinary seasons couldn't match. As if the moment when human beings were stripped of every alternative and stood at the threshold with nothing to offer but the truth of their condition was precisely the moment when the agreement between human and forest was most fully realized. They expected this. They expected the desperation to be received. They expected the ritual to work more powerfully, if anything, for the reality of what they were carrying into it. And so they prepared with the specific combination of grief and hope that belongs to people who are placing everything on a single outcome and have made their peace with that. The night of the ritual began as all such nights had. The community gathered. The preparation of the child was undertaken with the same care, the same deliberateness, the same spoken and unspoken elements that every generation before them had brought to it. There was no deviation from the form. Every detail was observed. The appointed hour was honored. The group moved toward the forest's edge in the sequence that tradition prescribed, and the forest received their approach in its familiar way, that quality of attention, that sense of being perceived and tracked, that the most experienced among them knew how to read, and that the less experienced could feel even without the vocabulary to describe it. The threshold was reached. The correct spot, the roots, the stone, the gap between the trees, was identified without difficulty. The child was brought forward. The words were spoken. The gestures were made. The silence that followed the completion of the formal offering was the silence that had always followed it. Deep, dense, directional. Not empty, not indifferent, but full of something that the tradition had always interpreted as attention, as reception, as the moment before acceptance. And then something happened that the tradition had no name for. The sounds did not shift in the way they were supposed to. The birds did not change register. They went silent, which was different, which was wrong, which was a distinction that the experienced witnesses registered immediately as a deviation from the pattern. Not the settling silence of acceptance. The rigid, total silence of alarm. The silence of prey that has heard something it cannot see and is waiting to determine whether movement will make things better or worse. The wind did not move toward the threshold. The air did not carry that quality of directed breath, that sense of the forest inhaling what had been offered. Instead, and this is the detail that the witnesses would return to again and again in the accounts they gave afterward, the air moved away, a current that went in the wrong direction. That came from the forest toward the waiting community, not from the community toward the forest. Not welcoming, not receiving. More like, and this is the word that multiple witnesses used independently without coordination, warning. And in the shadows between the trees, at the edge of perception, something was there. The presence was undeniable. Every person present felt it. It had the quality that the tradition associated with the forest's acknowledgement, that density of dark, that sense of attention directed outward toward the threshold, but the quality of that attention was different. Wrong in a way that the body registered before the mind had produced a single word for it. In all the previous performances, the attention from the darkness had felt like being assessed and found acceptable. What the witnesses felt on this night was assessment of a different kind, not the assessment that precedes acceptance. Something that felt, in the nervous systems of every person standing at that threshold, like the assessment that precedes a decision they were not prepared for. The presence moved closer, and then it stopped. And in the space between its stopping and what should have come next, in the interval that the tradition had always filled with the sense of contact, of connection, of the offering being taken, nothing happened. Or rather, something happened that was more unsettling than nothing. The presence withdrew. Not suddenly, not in alarm, not in the way that a frightened animal retreats. Deliberately. With the quality of something that has looked at what has been offered, considered it fully, and decided for reasons it did not explain, and was under no obligation to explain, that it would not be taken. The forest refused the offering. The silence that followed was of a kind that none of the witnesses had experienced before, and that none of them, in the accounts they later gave, could describe with full satisfaction. Because it wasn't simply quiet. It was a quiet that had a quality of aftermath, the silence of something having already happened, of a door having already been closed, of a decision having already been made on the other side of a threshold that was now, unmistakably, no longer open. The community stood at the edge of the forest, and the forest no longer felt like the edge of a relationship. It felt like the edge of something else, something without a name in any language they had. The child was brought back. She had not cried, had not spoken, had not shown in any external way the distress that every adult present was working to contain. But those who looked at her closely in the moments after the withdrawal, in the light of the torches on the walk back, in the harsher illumination of the settlement, noticed something in her face that they struggled afterward to name. Not fear, not confusion. Something more considered than both of those things. The expression of a person who has perceived something directly that others have only perceived indirectly, and who is still in the process of deciding what to do with the knowledge. When asked later what she had seen at the threshold, she said something that the adults present did not know how to receive. She said that something had come to the edge of the trees and looked at her. She said it had stayed there for a long time, looking. And then she said, and this is the sentence that circulated among the community afterward, with the persistence of something that refuses to be forgotten. She said that it had looked at her the way you look at something you recognize, but in a way you were not expecting. It knew her, but it was not what they had thought it was. The aftermath of a broken ritual is a particular kind of crisis, and understanding it requires understanding what the ritual was doing for the community that practiced it. Not just theologically or spiritually, but functionally, psychologically, in terms of the practical work that shared sacred practice does in the lives of the people who depend on it. A ritual is not simply a performance. It is a technology, a tool for managing the relationship between human consciousness and the aspects of reality that human consciousness cannot fully control. It creates the experience of agency in situations where agency is otherwise unavailable. It provides a structure for engaging with uncertainty that transforms the uncertainty from something paralyzing into something navigable. And it does this not through illusion, at least not in the traditions that have lasted long enough to prove themselves, but through genuine engagement with whatever forces or dynamics the ritual was designed to address. When the technology fails, the crisis is not merely practical, it is existential. Because the failure of the ritual is not just the failure to produce a specific outcome, it is the failure of the entire framework within which that outcome was understood to be possible. It throws into question not just this event, but every previous event. Was the protection ever real? Were the good seasons ever genuinely connected to what the community did at that threshold? Was the sense of being in relationship with the forest ever anything more than a story the community told itself to make the uncertainty of their situation manageable? These questions arrived in the community like a flood, and like a flood, they did not come in order or at a respectful pace. They came all at once, and they came into everything. Into conversations between people who had been having those same conversations for decades and who suddenly found that all of the shared assumptions that had made those conversations easy were no longer available to them. Into the way people looked at the forest from the edge of the settlement, not with the familiar combination of respect and ease that comes from knowing you are in right relationship with something, but with a wariness that had no specific object, a sense of exposure that had no specific source. Strange things happened in the days following. Small things mostly. The kind of things that would not have warranted comment in an ordinary week, but that, in the charged atmosphere of a community processing a fundamental disruption, accumulated a significance they would not otherwise have carried. Animals behaved unusually at the settlement's edge. Not dangerously, not in any way that represented a specific threat, but in ways that deviated from the patterns that the community had learned to read as normal. A deer that stood at the tree line for hours without moving, watching the settlement with an attention that felt, to the people who observed it, like something more than animal curiosity. Sounds in the night that were familiar individually but arranged in sequences that weren't. The calls of familiar birds at unfamiliar hours, in unfamiliar combinations, as if a language the community had always been able to read had rearranged its grammar. And the elders, the ones who carried the most direct knowledge of the tradition, who had performed or witnessed the ritual the most times, who had the deepest investment in the framework it supported, were the ones hit hardest. Not because they were weaker than the others, but because they had the most to lose. When you have built an entire life inside a particular understanding of how the world works, and that understanding reveals itself to be less certain than you believed, the ground does not simply shift beneath you, it disappears. And the freefall that follows is not just intellectual, it is bodily, it is identity level. The kind of disorientation that wakes you at 3 in the morning with a specific flavor of terror that has no single identifiable object, but that saturates everything. One elder, the oldest among them, the one whose memory of the tradition reached furthest back, said something in a private conversation that was later repeated so many times it became part of the community's account of the event. She said that what frightened her most was not that the forest had refused, it was that she did not believe the forest had changed. She believed she was the same, the community was the same, the ritual had been performed with the same care and the same intention as always. Which meant that the refusal had to mean something about the relationship, not about its current state, but about something in its fundamental nature that had always been true and that she was only now being forced to see. She said, "Perhaps the ritual never changed the forest's response. Perhaps the forest always responded exactly as it chose to, for its own reasons, in its own time. And perhaps what the ritual had actually been doing, all these generations, was not creating a favorable response, but simply trusting that the response would be favorable, and mistaking that trust over time for a mechanism of control. This is the hidden revelation at the center of the event, and it is the one that opens into territory that reaches far beyond this particular community and this particular forest. Because the story of a ritual that worked reliably for generations and then suddenly didn't is also a story about the nature of every framework human beings have ever built to manage their relationship with what they cannot control. And that story is not located in the past. It is not confined to communities that perform ancient rites at the forest's edge. It is happening, in one form or another, in every life, in every time, whenever a belief that has always produced the expected result suddenly doesn't. And the person holding that belief is forced to confront the question of whether they were ever really in the kind of relationship with the world that they thought they were. The theories that emerged in the community in the wake of the refusal were many and contradictory, and all of them were partial, and none of them was satisfying. And this is probably the most honest thing that can be said about theories generated in the immediate aftermath of a framework-shattering event. They are not explanations, they are attempts to generate explanations. Preliminary moves in a longer process that has no guaranteed endpoint and no promise of resolution. The first theories were the most reactive, ones that assigned blame, that identified a specific error in the ritual's performance, that proposed a deviation from tradition as the source of the failure. These were psychologically the most comforting because they preserved the framework. The ritual still works, the tradition is still sound, we simply made a mistake that can be identified and corrected. The corrective theory is always the first one because it asks the least of the people who need to believe it. But the witnesses who had been closest, the ones who had stood at the threshold and felt the quality of the withdrawal, who had looked at the child's face in the torchlight afterward, who had heard the elder's words in the days that followed, found the corrective theory increasingly difficult to hold, not because they could identify a specific flaw in it, but because they had experienced something at the threshold that didn't feel like the consequence of a mistake. It felt like a response, a deliberate, considered, intentional response from something that had every opportunity to accept what was offered and chose, for its own reasons, not to. And if it was a deliberate choice, then the question of why it was made is the question that everything else hinges on. Was the ritual always an illusion? This is the darkest theory, the one that goes furthest in dismantling the framework, and it is the one that the most intellectually rigorous members of the community found themselves unable to entirely dismiss. The argument runs like this. If the forest is a natural system rather than a conscious agent, then its responses to the ritual, the changes in sound, the quality of the air, the perceptions at the threshold, were never genuinely connected to the ritual's performance. They were the forest being the forest, responding to the presence of people, to the sounds they made, to the way their arrival and behavior changed the acoustic and atmospheric conditions at the edge of the trees. The community, observing these responses in the context of having just performed the ritual, interpreted them as connected. They built a tradition around that interpretation. The tradition reinforced the interpretation. And the interpretation was never tested in any way that could distinguish between the forest is responding to the ritual and the forest is responding to the presence of people, as it always does, and the ritual is an elaborate coincidence. The night of the refusal on this reading was simply a night when the forest behaved differently, for ecological reasons, for weather reasons, for any number of reasons that had nothing to do with the community's desperate need. And the perceived withdrawal, the sense of something approaching and then turning away, was the community's experience of their own failed expectation imposed onto a natural phenomenon that was never, in any real sense, listening. This theory is rigorous. It is coherent. It is the kind of theory that the modern mind reaches for automatically because it requires the fewest unverifiable assumptions. And yet, and this is the thing that even the most analytically minded witnesses found themselves unable to fully resolve, it doesn't account for everything. It doesn't account for the consistency of the experience across so many witnesses and so many performances. It doesn't account for the specific quality of the difference between the previous responses and this one, a difference that the most experienced witnesses described not as a quantitative shift, but as a qualitative one, not as less of the same thing, but as a different thing entirely. It doesn't account for the child's words. The forest had changed is a theory with a different texture, one that preserves the reality of the relationship while reframing its terms. On this reading, the forest is real as an agent. The ritual's connection to its responses is genuine. But something in the forest's situation or disposition has shifted in a way that made this particular offering unacceptable. Perhaps the relationship required something different now than it had required before. Perhaps the community had taken without fully giving in some dimension that wasn't captured by the formal ritual. Perhaps the forest's needs had evolved, and the tradition, designed for a previous version of the relationship, was no longer adequate to address them. This theory is painful in a different way than the first one. It doesn't dismantle the framework. It complicates it. It suggests that the tradition was not wrong but incomplete, that the relationship was real but had been misunderstood in some important dimension. And it opens a question that is, for people whose entire understanding of their safety and belonging rests on the stability of this relationship, perhaps the most frightening question of all. What does the forest want now, if not what it has always been given? Something was awakened is the theory that sits at the edge of what the tradition was designed to contain. It suggests that the refusal was not a statement about the relationship between the community and the forest, but an introduction. That whatever the ritual had been in contact with, across all the generations of its performance, was not the totality of what the forest contained, that there was something deeper, something that the surface relationship with the forest's responsive intelligence had been all along sitting on top of. Something that had been there through all the ritual performances, not refusing and not accepting, simply waiting. And that on this particular night, for reasons that may or may not be accessible to human understanding, it had moved. Not to accept, not to refuse, but to be seen. The child's words sit in the center of all of these theories, like a stone in still water, sending out rings that reach every edge. She had looked at something that looked at her the way you look at something you recognize, but in a way you weren't expecting. This is not the language of a child who has witnessed a natural phenomenon. It is not the language of a child experiencing collective fear. It is the language of a child who has had a direct perceptual experience of something and is reporting it with the honesty that children bring to direct experience before the adult pressure to interpret that experience through approved frameworks has fully taken hold. She was not afraid. That is the detail that returns and returns and returns. In a scene that had terrified every adult present, in the middle of a ritual performance that was going wrong in ways that undermined the foundations of everything the community knew, the child who had been closest to whatever was at the threshold was not afraid. She was something else, something that looked, to the people who examined her face in the torchlight, like a person who has been given a piece of information that is genuinely surprising but not threatening. The expression of someone who has had a belief corrected, not shattered, not contradicted but refined, made more accurate. As if what she had encountered at the threshold was not the terrifying unknowable that her elder's fear suggested. As if it was something that she, with a child's unmediated perception and a child's undefended openness, had received differently than the adults had. Not as rejection, not as refusal, as something that had looked at her, at the offering, at the community, at the entire accumulated weight of the tradition, and decided that something different was required, something more honest, something that went beyond the form of the ritual to whatever the ritual had originally been trying to express. As if the forest was not done with them, as if the refusal was not an ending but a demand, as if the relationship, far from being broken, was insisting on being remade on terms that the tradition, in its long and successful history, had never been required to discover. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because the territory it opens leads somewhere that most conversations about ancient ritual and its relationship to the natural world never quite reach. somewhere that sits at the intersection of psychology, ecology, philosophy, and the kind of lived human experience that defies clean categorization but insists on being taken seriously. The question of what it means for a relationship to demand to be remade, for the familiar form of a connection to suddenly become insufficient, for the thing you've always offered to suddenly not be what's wanted, is not a question that belongs exclusively to communities with ancient forest rituals. It is a question that every human being who has ever been in a genuinely important relationship has faced or will face in one form or another. The relationship that has worked for years on certain terms suddenly requiring different ones. The understanding that has sustained a bond suddenly revealing itself to be partial. True as far as it went, but not going far enough. The moment when what you've always given is handed back to you, not with contempt, but with a kind of patient, inarguable insistence that you find what is actually needed and offer that instead. This is one of the most difficult human experiences there is, not because it is violent, it rarely is, in its most meaningful forms, but because it requires the surrender of a self-understanding that has been, up to this point, functional. The version of yourself that knew how to be in this relationship, that knew what was required, that had the security of a proven track record. That version is no longer adequate, not wrong, not bad, simply no longer enough. And the process of discovering what is enough, when you don't yet know what it looks like, is a process that has no shortcut and no schedule, and no guarantee of arriving anywhere you can recognize in advance. The community at the forest's edge was inside this process. They had been inside it from the moment the presence withdrew. And the path forward, if there was a path forward, was going to require something from them that the tradition, in its long and successful history, had never prepared them for: genuine uncertainty about the terms of the relationship. Genuine openness to the possibility that what the forest required was not a better performance of what they had always done, but a willingness to stop, to listen in a way they hadn't been listening, and to let the forest tell them what it actually needed, if it was willing to tell them at all. The eldest among them, in her most private reflections in the days that followed, arrived at a thought that she shared with no one for a long time. It came to her not in the form of a theory, but in the form of a feeling, the kind that arrives before you have language for it, and that you have to circle carefully, in the dark, before you can find the edges of it well enough to speak it. The feeling was this: that the forest had always known what it was doing, that it had received every offering with full awareness, that nothing it had done across all the generations of the ritual had ever been accidental or passive, and that if it had chosen now to refuse, if the something that moved in the deep dark between the trees had looked at what was offered and turned away, it had done so not because the offering was wrong in form or intention, but because it was no longer sufficient in some dimension that the tradition had never been required to address. She thought, perhaps the ritual never changed the forest. Perhaps what it changed every time was us. And perhaps the refusal was not the forest ending the relationship. Perhaps it was the forest asking for the part of us that the ritual, in its successful, comfortable, generation after generation reliability, had never had to ask for before. The part that doesn't know what to do. The part that comes to the threshold without a form to follow and without a guarantee of being received. The part that is genuinely, uncomfortably, irreducibly present, not in the performance of a tradition, but in the naked truth of its own need. Perhaps the forest, in refusing, was asking for something it had never needed to ask for before, because the tradition had always provided it without knowing that it was providing it, until the night when desperation replaced routine, and the quality of desperation that arrived at the threshold was not the honest desperation of people who have nothing left, but the desperate clinging of people who are too frightened to let go of the form, even when the form is no longer the thing that's needed. Perhaps the offering was refused, not because it was wrong, but because the people making it were not yet willing to make the only offering that the moment actually required, the offering of not knowing, the offering of being lost. The offering of standing at the edge of a relationship that has always sustained you and admitting in full and without performance that you don't know how to be in it anymore, and that you are here anyway, not with a ritual, not with a form, just here. The child understood this. She had gone to the threshold without a theory, without a framework, without the accumulated weight of a tradition that told her what the experience was supposed to mean. She had gone as herself, small, present, undefended, and what had come to the edge of the trees had looked at her and recognized something it had been waiting for, in some form, for a very long time. The elders called it a rejection. The child had experienced something that was almost its opposite. And somewhere in the space between those two experiences, between the adult's terror of the form failing and the child's openness to what the form had been covering, the actual meaning of the night was living, waiting to be found, by people who were willing to stop defending what they knew long enough to discover what they didn't. Talvez o ritual nunca tenha sido aceito, apenas tolerado. Perhaps the ritual was never accepted. Perhaps it was only ever tolerated, received with patience by something ancient enough to understand that the form, imperfect as it was the best that the people making it knew how to offer. Tolerated not with contempt, but with the particular quality of patience that belongs to things that operate on a different time scale than the beings that come to them with their hands full of what they have to give. And perhaps the night of the refusal was the night when patience ran out, not as punishment, but as invitation. The invitation to finally, after all the seasons and all the performances and all the comfort of a tradition that had never failed, to finally come empty-handed, to come with nothing to offer but the truth of what was actually present, to discover whether the relationship, stripped of every form that had sustained it, was real enough to survive in its bare, unmediated, unmistakable essence. Whether the community accepted that invitation, whether anyone walked back to that threshold in the days and weeks that followed, and what happened when they did, is something that the accounts do not resolve. And I think there is a reason for that. I think the tradition preserved the unresolved ending deliberately, because the unresolved ending is the honest one. Because the question that the refusal opened was not the kind that gets answered in a single night or in a single season, or perhaps in a single human lifetime. It is the kind that gets carried into the next generation and the next, as an inheritance that looks, on the surface, like a broken tradition, but that is actually something more valuable. A living question. One that refuses to be closed. One that insists, with each new person who inherits it, on being opened again. The forest is still there. The threshold is still there. The gap between the two trees still frames the same depth of shadow it always did. And if you were to stand there at the edge of night, in the space between the last light and the first dark, with nothing to offer and nowhere to go, you might feel something. Not acceptance, not refusal. Something that preceded both of those things. Something older than the ritual and older than the tradition and older than the community that built itself in the forest's shadow. Something that has been there through all of it, waiting with the patience of things that do not measure time the way we do, for the moment when the offering is finally, truly, honestly made. If something in this story is sitting with you, if it opened something you've been carrying quietly, drop a comment and write, "The forest knows." Let me know you felt it. If you stayed until this moment, you already know that this wasn't just a story about a ritual, or a forest, or a night. That went differently than expected. It was something closer to a mirror, one of those quiet, unexpected reflections that arrives without announcing itself and leaves you looking at something you weren't quite prepared to see. That's the kind of content this channel exists to create. Not noise, not distraction, but the kind of story that finds you at the right moment and leaves something behind. A question, a feeling, a thread you'll keep pulling on long after the video ends. So if this one found you, if something in it landed in a place you recognize, leave a comment right now with the words, "I came to the threshold." That's all. It's a small gesture, but it tells me something important. That the story reached the right person, and that matters more than any number I could put on a screen. If this video earned a place in your afternoon, your evening, wherever you are right now, the like button is how you pass that forward. It's how this kind of storytelling finds its way to someone else who needs it quietly, without knowing yet that they're looking for it. And if you're not subscribed, I'd love for you to consider it, not out of obligation, but out of the simple recognition that if this story resonated, there are others waiting that will too. Stories that ask something of you, stories that don't resolve too quickly or explain too much, the kind that treat you like someone who can hold complexity without needing it smoothed over. There's a video right alongside, this one that picks up a thread very close to this one, a different story, a different edge, but the same quality of darkness and depth and the thing that lives just beyond what we can explain. Click on it and come with me. The threshold is still open,